This afternoon we have a panel on virtue and gender. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw will present first on and give us an Aristotelian point of departure in virtue understood as relative to us. Then Dr. Mark Spencer will speak from a Thomistic perspective, from the perspective of Aquinas, and his indication of gender as something accidental, not substantial. And finally, I'll speak on sex and gender in relation to marriage, understood from a Steinian perspective. And I think from what we've discussed, these inputs will be more or less coherent, and it's a nice development through time from Aristotle to Thomas to Stein. So we'll begin and welcome Elizabeth Shaw.
I regret that I'm joining this program only today. I came in last night. So I ask you to forgive me if I'm, in turning to these points in Aristotle, if in doing that I'm repeating or belaboring some points that have already been adequately expressed. But my mind just sort of instinctively goes to Aristotle's doctrine of virtue when we want to get into the general theme of virtue and gender. I also think that pedagogically it's helpful to begin with what's familiar when we're entering into discussions of things that are new. So we all know, I presume, that in his Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Aristotle lays out the idea of virtue as a habit or disposition that is a mean between two extremes, and one extreme of excess and the other of deficiency. For example, the virtue of generosity sits between what we may call stinginess on the one hand and wastefulness or profligacy on the other. The virtue of courage sits between the vices of cowardice on the one hand and rashness on the other. Okay, so this is a basic helpful framework for thinking about virtue in general. I'm working through Hildebrand's text on ethics at the moment and happen to know that he takes issue with the doctrine of the mean for reasons I don't wish to get into right now. But the helpful framework for thinking about virtue, it is one, but at the same time, we need to be cautioned against taking it too simplistically, and specifically cautioned against two errors or traps. One, the error or trap of thinking that this is just another way of thinking about that old cliche moderation in all things, right? That's not what Aristotle's getting at. Certainly there are certain things that cannot be done in moderation, right? So that's not what Aristotle's talking about. We're talking about the doctrine of the mean. And another trap or error is thinking of virtue as a mean or a middle or an average in a rigid arithmetic sense, a mathematical sense. Virtue is not a rigid, fixed thing, a one-size-fits-all sort of thing, like the average is in mathematics, in arithmetic. So we avoid the connotations of fixed, rigid, one-size-fits-all, the same for all people at all times, in all places, etc. In mathematics, the mean of 10 and 2 is always 6, no matter what planet you're on or century you're living in. Virtue is not like that, right? And Aristotle gives us, in his text, the analogy of the trainer who's working with an athlete, right? And if the trainer knows for certain that 2 pounds of food is too little for this person to be eating a day, and 10 pounds of food is too much, we don't rush to the conclusion that 6 pounds is exactly the right amount, right? The trainer needs to take into consideration the particulars about that athlete. Is this somebody who is training to be a sumo wrestler? Is this someone who's training to be a marathoner? Okay, is this person already fit, or is this person overweight or underweight, etc. Right. So the correct amount of food, the right amount, the mean, is relative to the person we're dealing with. Okay, so Another way of expressing this idea, this doctrine of the mean, I like to say, I like to put it this way. It's not something fixed. It's not something rigid. It's not blindly following a rule, even. It's sort of an extension of this idea of not fixed, not rigid, not blindly following a rule, but rather virtue as a mean is something supple, contoured, contextual. Okay. It has everything to do with the person and his or her circumstances. Okay, so we may use the language of relative to us. Okay, virtue is relative to us in this sense, not relative in the sense of moral relativism, of course. I prefer contoured, supple, contextual, a function of the person and his or her circumstances. So it's not a hard point to grasp. I'm sure most, if not all of us, are familiar with it, right? As an example that I use in class all the time to express this point, I say to my students, and I teach at Catholic University, it's in the city. Imagine you are walking down Michigan Avenue. It's a city, one of the borders of campus, late at night, and you hear a voice from behind saying to you, "Stop. Turn around slowly and give me your phone, your keys, your wallet." Okay. What do? What's the right course of action? What's the virtuous thing to do? What do you do in this situation? All right, and most students respond, the right thing to do is to comply, to do what you're told in that situation. Of course, always there's maybe a daring young gentleman in the room who says, "I'm going to fight back." In any case, so we're generally agreed that that's the rule. That's what you do, okay? Don't cause a fuss. Don't cause a stir. Do what you're being asked to do and hopefully get away with your life, okay? But then I ask students, well, what if you are an undercover policeman? Is that what you do, right? No. That you don't just simply hand your things over to a criminal if you're a policeman, right? You have different responsibilities, different duties, different capacities, okay? What do you do if you turn around expecting that you're going to do what you're being asked to do, and you see that voice came from a little 5-year-old, right? You do something different. You say, "What are you doing here? Go home," or something. So, point, the example makes the point. Virtue is not blindly following a rule. Virtue is not something fixed, rigid. It's supple. It's contoured. It has everything to do with using reason to assess your circumstances and determining what's appropriate to do given those circumstances. And an important part of that assessment is a self-assessment. Who am I? What am I? Okay, what can I do? What can I reasonably expect to accomplish in this situation? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Okay, so that's what virtue requires. Okay, making an assessment of my circumstances and including a self-assessment. Okay, who am I and what can I do? What can I reasonably expect to accomplish given my own strengths and weaknesses, my own capacities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what virtue is. Okay, and that's what we mean by saying that virtue is relative to us. Okay, it derives from, in a large way, this self-awareness, this self-assessment, a knowledge, an honest, realistic knowledge of myself and my own strengths and weaknesses, and who I am. Okay. And of course, we can introduce the language of prudence, too. The intellectual virtue of prudence has everything to do with knowing those details. Okay. So this is basically all I want to say here, the Aristotelian piece, to lay out a framework for thinking about the theme of virtue and gender. And sort of tie it up and lead into perhaps what my fellow panelists have to expand on is this. My suggestion is, to the extent that our genderedness means that we have relevant differences vis-a-vis our capacities for action. And to the extent that we don't have relevant differences vis-a-vis our capacities for action, there's two sides of the coin here. An honest assessment of and awareness of those differences or their lack is crucial. So again, to repeat my point, any further discussion in this area, the theme of virtue and gender, is essentially an application of Aristotle's point, the Aristotelian idea that virtue is not rigid, but rather supple, contoured. It's a function of who I am and what I can do. So, thank you.
Okay, so picking up on that Aristotelian point, I want to look at three thinkers. So Professor McNamara mentioned that I was going to be looking at this from a Thomistic point of view, and Thomas Aquinas certainly is going to be the center point of my remarks today, but I want to bring in some material from Plato, and then to anticipate Professor McNamara's talk, some material from Stein as well, building on some of what we heard this morning. So like a lot of questions about virtue, I think the question about the relation between virtue and gender or sex is a question fundamentally, again, about anthropology. Everything goes back to what are we? Right? So here the question in part is going to be, what is gender? What is sex in a metaphysical sense? And since virtue, as we've seen, involves a sort of harmony, fittingness, proportion among the various powers of the person, then we need to ask what in the sexual or gendered person, as each of us is, requires harmonization so that we can have a habit of choosing the good. And that's a way of applying this idea of the mean relative to us. So what difference does being masculine, being feminine make to one's powers that would make a difference in terms of forming oneself in virtue? I want to lay out the basis of a certain position on this, again, trying to steer a middle course between two extreme positions. And maybe some of what I say here might be controversial. John Henry has encouraged us to be mildly controversial, so I don't know. If there's a controversy, let's have it during the question and answer period. The two positions I want to avoid are what follows. First, the position that virtue is exactly the same in men and women. That being a man or being a woman makes no difference at all to the moral life, and that there are no morally relevant calls belonging in particular to men or women. So I think that's one extreme that needs to be avoided as ignoring a morally relevant feature of the metaphysics of the person. The second position that I think needs to be avoided, the other extreme, is that there are entirely distinct virtues that belong to men and that belong to women. That there are particularly masculine virtues or particularly feminine virtues, or that certain virtues don't need to be pursued by one gender or the other. Rather, I want to argue that there are, at least in the moral sphere, there are human virtues, and that these are going to be lived out in distinct ways by men and women. And I see some personalists, maybe even Hildebrand, I don't know, maybe even Stein in some texts, as tending towards this second position. Hildebrand, for example, calls man and woman two different expressions of human nature. I don't want to deny that claim, but I want to make sure that we're interpreting it in a plausible way. And in particular, with this second extreme that I want to avoid, I just want to note I'm skeptical that we can identify anything essential, normative, or metaphysical that belongs to all and only men or all and only women. Von Hildebrand often takes the approach of pointing to certain exemplars. He looks at Shakespeare's characters a lot as typical men and typical women. I think it's probably a much more promising route than saying all men are thus and such and list a bunch of personality traits, and all women are thus and such and list a different set of personality traits. And I think we can talk about the value and richness of sexual difference, sexual complementarity, without trying to give a rigid definition of each gender. Okay, turning briefly to my three readings that I assigned you. The first selection I gave you comes from Plato's Republic. And I only want to touch on some very brief points from this text. So in the Republic, Socrates is trying to discover what justice is. And he decides we'll be able to see what justice is by painting the picture of the ideal city, and then we'll see what justice looks like within that city. And he says that for a city to be just, everyone must do the work that he or she is suited to do by nature. And he seems to assume something like the point that Dr. Shaw made, that virtue is relative to us. And so I need to know what is morally relevant in me such that I can see what traits that I have require me to tweak how virtue looks in me such that it is relative to me. So for example, the fact that I have brown hair, or the fact that I have a stomach, or the fact that I have white skin, or that I'm 5 feet 6 inches tall, none of these things are morally relevant differences. I don't live my virtue in a different way just because of the color of my hair. The question then is gender, is sex, a morally relevant difference? Now, Socrates thinks that the natures of men and women differ, but he ultimately argues that when it comes to reason, that is, when it comes to particularly human tasks that we can perform, for example, administering the state, contemplating the good, the beautiful, the true, these sorts of things, men and women are both equally able to perform these tasks. So when it comes to those traits that are particularly morally relevant, Plato wants to insist we find the exact same virtues in men and women. Were we to find distinct rational powers in men or women, then it would make sense to say there are virtues that belong to men and there are other virtues that belong to women. That's not the route that Plato goes. My second selection that I gave you was from St. Thomas Aquinas, from his famous metaphysical text on being and essence. And here he lays out a metaphysics of masculinity and femininity. What are these in the person? And here I want to refer back to some things that came up in the discussion this morning when we were talking about what's the grounding for authenticity. And we talked a bit about how there seems to be this unique formal element in the person. And we saw this from Stein and from the Franciscan thinkers. So just to recap a little bit, form is the thing in you, the principle in you that gives you identity, right? We're all composed of matter that's always in a state of change. What is it that gives you your unchanging identity over time, such that even though you change your matter continually over time, you change all of your matter every few years, you still remain exactly the same person over time? Aquinas, Aristotle, the scholastics call that thing your form or your soul. It's the principle of identity over time. Matter, on the other hand, the stuff you're made out of, is what receives your form, what's structured by your form, what locates your form here and now in this spatiotemporal location. Your form and your matter compose what Aquinas calls your substance, right? The thing you most fundamentally are. All of your changeable characteristics he calls accidents. Now, to say that something is an accident is not to say that it is unimportant or unnecessary for a flourishing human life. Most of the things we care about in people are accidents, on Aquinas' view. All of your actions are accidents. All of your changeable characteristics are accidents. Furthermore, on Aquinas' view, you have some accidents that are unchanging. They don't belong to your form and matter essentially. They aren't what you are most fundamentally. But they're also not things that can change about you. So for example, the abilities, the powers that you have, your power of thinking, your power of willing, your power of feeling, these are crucial to being a human person, and yet they're accidents on Aquinas' view. They are further features of the person over and above what we most fundamentally are. Now, some of our accidents on Aquinas' view come from our form, right? In virtue of being this kind of thing, a human thing, I have certain accidents. Again, those powers that I just mentioned. Other accidents that I have come from our matter. And Aquinas argues, plausibly I think, that sex, masculinity and femininity, comes from our matter. That is, it's in virtue of the fact that you came into existence with a certain chromosomal inheritance that you are masculine or feminine. Now again, this is not to say that Aquinas thinks masculinity and femininity are changeable. He doesn't. It's not to say that he thinks they're unimportant. He thinks they're quite important. Rather, it's just to say to be a man or to be a woman, on Aquinas' view, does not come from the form, does not come from that unchanging non-material principle in virtue of which we are human. Rather, it comes from the matter, from what you received bodily from your parents. But it comes from the matter in a very particular way. Aquinas says that masculinity and femininity do not come from our matter in the same way that, again, the color of your hair, the color of your skin, the size you're likely to grow to be comes from our matter. All of those we inherit from our parents materially, but we inherit those in a way that, as it were, does not reach up into our form in the same way that masculinity and femininity do. We inherit those from our matter, and yet they are directly oriented to our form. That means they are directly oriented to the way in which we exercise our powers. So although Aquinas is going to argue masculinity and femininity come from matter, they affect the way we live out thinking, acting, willing, feeling, and so forth. And so for that reason, he's going to maintain there's the exact same virtues in men and women, but they are lived out in a distinctive way in the two genders, which fits with this metaphysics we see from Aristotle. Let me just close, though, with contextualizing this with a point that Edith Stein makes in her magnum opus, Finite and Eternal Being. As we saw this morning, and I don't want to belabor the point, Stein thinks that each of us has a particular nature. Right? I talked this morning in answering a question that on her view, there's something like Mark Spencer-ness, right? Rob McNamara-ness, Elizabeth Shaw-ness, like a particular style that each of us lives out humanity with. We're not just generic human beings. We have a particular essence, a unique form out of which we act, and that is unrepeatable. Now, it seems plausible to say that if we take this claim from Stein and bring it together with this account of gender that we see in Aquinas, that we would say, well, masculinity and femininity then maybe belong to our particularity as well. Because my form was created by God in this matter, oriented to informing this matter, and since this matter is masculine matter, it makes sense to say that it belongs to this special, unique, unrepeatable Mark Spencer-ness, that it's a masculine way of living out humanity. But the emphasis here is on the individuality, on me as a particular person. This is to say, although I am essentially a man, I am not necessarily essentially a man in the same way that every other man is essentially a man. I am a man in a particular way, and this would ground my earlier contention that there's no way to draw up an exhaustive list of characteristics that all and only men have, and another list of characteristics that all and only women have, such that we could say this is the way for men to live out the virtues, and this is the way for women to live out the virtues, full stop. Rather, we would have to say every man lives out the virtues in a masculine way, and every woman lives out the virtues in a feminine way, but in a way relative or particularized to that person and their unique essence. I'm going to stop there, and we can discuss this further during the question and answer period and turn it over to Professor McNamara.
So I'm going to give you a Steinian perspective on sex and gender, understood from the perspective of Christian marriage. And it needs to be said first that we began this discussion last night, a number of us, over cigars and bourbon. So some of what I will speak about today was formed in the context of that discussion, or crystallized in the context of that discussion. As many of you will be aware, Edith Stein is known as a Christian feminist. And this is because she spoke frequently in the 1920s and 1930s on the topic of woman, precisely because she was requested to do so given the 20th century's interest in the academic and professional development of women. However, it also needs to be said that her writings on women are one volume of a 27-volume whole. And so she is certainly, yes, a Christian feminist, but it's only one part of a greater whole. The assigned reading I gave for our reflection today, I assigned particularly because there she speaks about sex or gender in a more broad context, including both man and woman, because she looks at it in terms of the vocation according to nature and supernature, nature and grace, to enter into Christian marriage. And this, it seems to me, casts light upon our understanding of sex or gender, and also what significance it might have for virtue. For the purposes of my input today, I'm going to take it that sex is a natural bodily determination, the binary determination of male and female, and that gender is the personal expression of sex. You could call this the bottom-up influence of sex upon the rest of human nature, even though it has this bodily foundation. And this personal expression of sex, I'd say, happens in a particular cultural, social milieu. Now, as I said, Stein speaks about sex in the assigned article in the context of the vocation, the natural and supernatural vocation to enter into marriage or sacramental marriage. However, the broader context is an understanding of salvation. Now, even though this is a theological datum, we can understand this from a philosophical perspective as the call to human perfection. And for Stein, salvation, or the call to human perfection, is had by both man and woman alike. And therefore, the unity in humanity that we share is decisive in a foundational way in terms of our call to perfection, part of which is realized in the development of virtue. So virtue is our moral perfection. Since man and woman both share this unity in humanity, all of the same human powers, we have the same call to perfection, therefore the same life of virtue. So I'm going to propose that sex is not primarily significant, or gender is not primarily significant for the development of virtue. However, we can rightly ask ourselves, does sex or gender have some significance for the development of virtue? Does it bear significance for virtue? Well, if we look at this from the perspective of the context of marriage and the family that it can rise from marriage, we have light cast upon what import sex might have for virtue. Now, when we think of marriage, we think, first of all, of the consent to marriage. And we see that to enter into marriage, you need a certain bodily maturity, but bodily maturity is simply not enough. You also have to attain a certain level of personal maturity to be able to assume the responsibilities of married life and the family life that comes along with it. And so even though sex is what primarily determines marriage, and I would say we can only understand sex in the context of marriage, and likewise marriage in the context of sex, such that marriage and sex are mutually explanatory, it's not merely about what is bodily, but of course about what is personal. Sex has import in the person, and this is the expression of sex and gender. And so within the unity in humanity that man and woman share alike, there is this duality of sex, a duality of sex that bears reference to marriage and family. And since the responsibilities of marriage and family are differentiated according to sex, then I'm going to argue that sex so also differentiates the development and shape of virtue. That is, inasmuch as a man is able to become a husband and father, a woman able to become a wife and mother, and being a husband and father is differentiated to being a wife and a mother, so also the development of virtue will be differentiated. Inasmuch as these vocations have some difference, so also the development of virtue will have some difference. Now, how do we understand that? Well, a husband and father, or a wife and a mother, assume different kinds of activities. And even in a more foundational way, the determination of sex conditions the way we consciously and freely choose even the same kinds of activities. So in two ways here, it seems to me we've got an import of sex upon the development of virtue. Virtue develops according to conscious choice. It's something of understanding and freedom. Inasmuch as sex has a conditioning impact upon conscious choice, it similarly conditions the development of virtue. How does it have such a conditioning impact? Well, one, men and women cognize the same kinds of acts differently. Men and women engage in the same kinds of acts differently. And also we engage in different kinds of activities, different kinds of freely chosen activities, precisely as husband, father, or wife and mother. And as much as these different kinds of activities, or differently cognized same kinds of activities, conditions those free activities, then we have a conditioning impact upon the development of virtue. And so, though, because we share this unity in humanity, all of the virtues are possible for both man and woman alike, such that there's no exclusively male or female virtues. Also, we can hold that sex conditions the development of virtue. We could call this a coloring of virtue. A man will have the same virtues as a woman, but they'll be differently colored. Now, the metaphor of color here is helpful because color is something that we have to experience to recognize its import. And similarly, we find it, I think, often very difficult to define the differentiation of man and woman, especially in the way it's lived out in life. And we find this difficulty when we discuss virtue also. We recognize that temperance has a different shape typically in a male human being than in a female human being. We recognize that fortitude has a different shape typically in a male human being than a female human being. And yet we recognize these differences nonetheless. And therefore, if we use this metaphor of color, something that must be experienced, we can identify these differences without necessarily putting words upon that differentiation itself. So, I'm going to first suggest that sex conditions the development of virtue such that virtue takes a different shape in man and woman, even though the same virtues are had by man and woman alike. Now, secondly, I'm going to propose something related but maybe different. Inasmuch as man and woman assume these vocational states differently, it seems to me that there is a kind of perfection to be had by the man that we could call manliness, and a kind of perfection that could be had by the woman that we could call womanliness. And that this is perhaps not a virtue, but something like a virtue. Perhaps it's merely this coloring of the other virtues or a coordination of the other virtues. But to assume the responsibilities of becoming a husband and father or wife and mother is really a true good to be realized by the human being. It's a responsibility that we understand and embrace freely. And in as much as we can understand it and embrace it freely, it seems to me that it's something that can attain its adequate perfection in our lives. And if it's something that can attain this adequate perfection in our lives, perhaps there is something like a virtue that we could call manliness for the male human being or womanliness for the female human being. Now, maybe, as I said, that is simply the coloring of the virtues in general. The male human being has a male coloring to the virtues in general. The female human being has a different coloring to the virtues in general. Or maybe this is something deeper, something more holistic, something different, manliness and womanliness. We see something like this in the contemporary interest in manliness and womanliness. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the blog, The Art of Manliness. There seems to be a cultural movement today, in contrast to the negation of the significance of sex and the denial of it in life, to embrace it, to accept it, to recognize it, and to live it towards its perfection. And that blog, The Art of Manliness, grasps something like this. And it seems to me what's been highlighted here is that manliness, gender as the personal expression of the male sex, womanliness, gender as the personal expression of the female sex, is really something that we've to personally appropriate, something we've to recognize in our lives, accept as part of who we are, and then develop until it attains its proper perfection. Which proper perfection is seen most clearly in light of the vocational state of married and family life, the ability to become husband and father, the ability to become wife and mother. And in as much as these are differentiated, then also we have the perfection of the human being similarly differentiated. And so, to summarize, and I won't speak for long because a lot of my propositions today here are Steinian influenced but tentative, and I'd like to work them out in our discussion. Given the unity in humanity, I propose that there are no exclusively male or exclusively female virtues. And yet at the same time, in as much as we have this sexual differentiation that finds personal expression in gender, perhaps also the virtues in general are typically colored in the male or typically colored in the female. Color here highlights the fact that it's something we can identify, is a visceral experience, but something that's very hard to put words upon. Then perhaps also there's a more holistic character trait that we could call manliness and womanliness. That is a differentiation of what it means to be human, to be perfected as human, whether male or female. All of this, I propose that we see most clearly in light of the vocational call to marriage and family life, precisely in the differentiation of becoming husband, father, or wife and mother. And the foundational principle that undergirds that is that sex and marriage are mutually explanatory. We can't understand one properly without understanding the other. They both came into being at the same moment, and they have an intimate correlativity.